Yeah. Mm-hmm.
I have one quick comment and another thing that I disagree with you on. One quick comment about the senators that came and that show when they talked about Mexico and
Yeah, the Daily Show.
yeah, I don't blame them because if he said otherwise, it would be political suicide for him. So I wouldn't blame him saying that because it's this or his career. So that's one thing. Second thing, about the fact that the main goal is for the Arab fear, I disagree with that. One thing is, I remember a quote by Moshe Dayan. He said, Arab governments are the dogs that protect Israel. Meaning that if you're looking at the Arab world, the one thing that most people have to understand is there's a big distinguishment between the puppet governments and the people. Basically most of these governments, the only way they get their livelihood, or the only way they're put on life support is through the American government, which is a big problem. Our government here is the only reason most of these puppets in Egypt or Jordan or Lebanon or Saudi Arabia or any of these areas are in power. And the only reason why Israel is protected from these people, I mean, if you look only at numbers, you got 90 million people in Egypt, you got almost 30, you got more than 20 million in Jordan, you got about over 30 million in Syria, you got about 4 million maybe, or even more in Lebanon. I mean, if you have these people go in with machine guns and some sticks on 40 million people in Israel, it would end the whole thing. But the problem is, when people start looking at that and look at the idea of fear to the reason of Gaza is just to make the Arabs fear. I don't think that's the main reason. Other than the fact, especially if you have to distinguish between the governments and the people. I mean, meaning in, say, in Egypt or Jordan, or if you only carry the idea, or every person carries the idea that people have to carry off arms and go to Israel to defend the Palestinians, the first people that will put you in jail or kill you are the Egyptian government or the Jordanian government. And so the fear of the people in these countries is mainly their own government, not Israel. I would feel, you know what I mean? But the only reason why they have to protect, I mean, there's another one, I think Rabin, he was talking about the peace treaty, and he was sitting with Ori Kot, or some of the people. He said, I felt like I was talking to myself. The peace treaty, I felt like I was talking to myself, you know. So just to wrap it up, I don't, you know, you have two different interests in these people.
I totally agree with you, but the fear that I was talking about and they wanted to create was Hezbollah was not speaking to the governments. It was speaking to the Arab people and saying that we have now shown that Israel can be defeated. And there was the fear by Israel, not that the governments would launch an attack, but that the people in the Arab world would now have some hope and some confidence that they didn't have to live in perpetual fear of an Israeli attack. So, you know, of course what you're saying is true, that the Arab governments acted in league with Israel, and ultimately so during the Gaza massacre. Mubarak sealed the border so that Israel could shoot down the Palestinians who had nowhere to flee. Of course that's correct, no disagreement.
Unfortunately, we don't have more time,
Oh.
so we would have to end the lecture tonight and the discussion. We will do one or two more quick questions.
Yeah, I have to catch a train. I didn't realize it was that late. There's a young Palestinian woman here, and I'd like to give her a chance to speak.
I first just wanted to applaud you for your courage in speaking the truth, despite all the criticism that you faced from people that have tried to silence you. And also, I initially thought that the reason why Israel had attacked Gaza was because they wanted to do their damage before the new Obama administration. I mean, I've heard that a lot in the media, and I think that maybe they feared punitive measures like cutting off aid to Israel.
No, it's true that the timing had to do with, the timing was affected by the Obama administration because you're not supposed to ruin the coronation. And Obama was going to be sworn into office on January 20th. It was supposed to be a big party. Most of us weren't invited to it. And so Israel had to end the slaughter on January 18th in order not to ruin the party. That's true. But we shouldn't have any illusions about Mr. Obama. He hasn't made any statements which indicate any support for the Palestinians. And frankly, the statements he's made have been just ghastly. The one he kept repeating about his two daughters, as if the 311 Palestinian children who were killed during the Gaza massacre didn't also have a right to live. Yes?
I heard that, I don't know if this is true, but I'm curious on your take on this. I heard that like they dropped white phosphorus onto hospitals and schools and stuff like that, but I heard that that was because Hamas hid or they stockpiled their weapons in places like that, so purposely so that they could later say, oh, Israel dropped it on civilians.
Yeah, that was a serious claim that was made. In the case of the hospitals, Israel bombed many hospitals during the Gaza massacre, and the claim was that Hamas officials or militants were hidden in the hospitals. And you can check for yourself, there's an organization called Physicians for Human Rights in Israel. It's an Israeli organization, not a Palestinian one. And they just put out a report on the Gaza massacre called Ill, I-L-L, Ill Morals, M-O-R-A-L-S. And they said they checked, they did as best as they could to check. There is no evidence at all that there were Hamas militants or officials in those hospitals when Israel attacked. You hear many things, of course, but then the question is whether what you hear is true or not. There seems to be, there's no evidence Israel attacked a lot of ambulances, blew them up. So far, there's no evidence that any of the ambulances were misused by Hamas. There seems to be evidence of some cases where Hamas stored weapons in a couple of mosques. That seems to be true. But the stuff that you heard about the ambulances, that Hamas was using it to transport weapons and militants, no evidence for it. What you heard about the hospitals, no evidence for it. Many of you probably heard that Hamas was using Palestinians as human shields. How many of you heard that? Okay, one of the two main human rights organizations in the world, Human Rights Watch, it just put out a study on what happened in Gaza, and it said we found no evidence at all, none, that Hamas used Palestinians as human shields. These things are just not true. They didn't happen. You know, that Hamas fired the rockets? Yes. Did the rocket firing constitute a war crime? Yes. But the other stuff, no, it just didn't happen. So far as we know. You know, maybe a new human rights report will find something else, but so far there's no evidence. A couple of other questions. Okay. Let's just do it rapid fire. I have to make sure I catch that. I have time. Right, because I have to leave at 8:15, right? That's what we calculate.
People want signed books, I believe. And
Yeah, I have, let's call it 10 minutes, so we're going to do it rapidly, and with just the hands are up now, I think 5, so I'll do 5 questions in 10 minutes. Go ahead.
I just wanted to disagree with you on the only U.S. interest in studying, because I feel like in the Arab world, Israel parallels what America.
Oh, no, I totally agree. I guess you misunderstood me. No, I totally agree. I said on the question of the Palestinians,
Yes.
Israel has no interest, the U.S. has no interest. But in the Arab world generally, yes, there's a parallel interest between the U.S. and Israel. I totally agree. Yeah, I guess I did not convey clearly my opinion. Yes?
Why has the U.S. Western media been so cooperative overall and in like making up these stories about?
That's a reasonable question. Why is the media lie so much about all of this? Why is the media like Jon Stewart says, it's the Mobius strip of politics? I think the reasons are twofold. Number one, any government that the United States supports gets a free ride in the media. You know that. They call Egypt, in the American media, they call Egypt a democracy. One of the most repressive and godforsaken dictatorships in the Middle East. Well, it's pro-American, so it's a democracy. It's a democracy where the head of state, he's an octogenarian cow. He's been in office since 1981. He's had emergency laws in effect since 1981. There's no law in Egypt. There's no rule of law. There are emergency laws since 1981. He has the torture chambers, the prisons, but because it's pro-American, we call it a democracy. And so Israel is pro-American, so they get a free ride as being an American dependency, and also because it's true. I mean, there's no point in lying here, because Jewish elites are very influential in the media. That's a fact. No point. I don't see any reason why not to say that. For the longest time, the history we learned in the United States was the history of white males. Okay, that's what we learned. That was the history, white males. So it's not a surprise that it's also white males who were the ones teaching the history, writing the history, and reporting the history. So you'd expect that white males would be the ones who predominate in the history we learned. So if you have newspapers, magazines where Jews are largely represented, a large number, it's not going to be a surprise that you'll get that kind of history. That's nothing to be afraid to say that. It's a reasonable expectation. Yes? I think I was going to ask that fellow that. We'll just go across. Yeah.
I just had a question. You said that they don't really have too many interests in Palestine itself, or just in the region.
Yeah.
And they feel that Israel could be like, some sort of satellite state that would keep the region in check for the U.S., kind of like symbiosis. But it seems to me that there is also an ideological aspect to it, because like every time I ask Americans here about how they feel about Israel, they always give me the answer that, I'm in support of Israel because Israel is God's, because there's this supposed tie to Christianity, and they feel that it's some sort of prophecy that Israel is supposed to exist and win, and they never really give me any further explanation.
I think that depends on who you talk to. I mean, there is a percentage of Americans who believe that sort of stuff, but I think most Americans support Israel for the reason that was suggested by the previous question, because the media portrays Israel in a way that it seems like they deserve support. I know there is a percentage, who believe God gave the land to the Jews, and that all the Jews have to go back, and then there'll be Armageddon, and everyone will kill each other, and there'll be rapture and whatever. Hey, it's America. What can I say? A lot of crazy things that go on in this place. Look what they had for president.
Yeah. The last question I had was just, now that we know what's going on, where do we go from here? I mean, Israel is not going to budge, and nothing seems to be changing, so what do you think is going to be the end result about this?
Speaking as a resolute atheist, God helps those who help themselves.